Have you ever been diminished not by words, but by a look that says, "You don't belong here, you're not good enough, you're just a meaningless number"? Amara Lewis knew that feeling all too well. She walked into the lavish boardroom of Helios Systems, where billion-dollar decisions are made. Polished wood gleamed under white lights. White men in flawless suits sat upright, staring at her like she was a shadow that had wandered in by mistake. The silence was heavy not with respect, but with contempt. But Amara hadn't come for their approval. She came to change the game. To prove that real power isn't in the chairs they sit on, but in the hands willing to flip the table. Robert Kessler, CEO of Helios, smirked when she extended her hand. He crossed his arms, leaned back, and said coldly, "I don't shake hands with employees." Laughter followed. They thought it was a joke. They thought she was nobody. But in just 1 hour, they would learn that the woman they mocked could wipe $4 billion off their company's value. This isn't just a story about arrogance. This is the story of how one black woman quietly toppled an empire. If this story resonates with you, like, share, and subscribe so we can spread this message. Real power isn't about crushing the weak. It's about standing up and changing the rules of the game. And it all began with a handshake that never happened. Have you ever walked into a room and felt every gaze like needles against your skin, not speaking, but screaming, "You don't belong here"? Amara Lewis knew that feeling all too well. When the doors to the 38th floor boardroom opened, she stepped into a space designed like a stage one meant to test her very presence. The room radiated power-polished wood, glinting under cold white lights. Modern art hung with precision on the walls, and a conference table so long it could make anyone feel small the moment they sat down. On either side, rows of middle-aged men in expensive suits turned their heads toward her, their eyes scanning from her shoes to her collar as if appraising an object, not acknowledging a human being. Amara wore a simple gray suit. No flashy jewelry, no signals of wealth or status. That was intentional. She didn't need to prove her worth with anything they could see. Yet she could feel their half-smirks, their unspoken judgment, the open disdain they didn't even bother to hide. To them, she wasn't a guest. She was an intrusion. She walked slowly toward the empty chair near the head of the table where Robert Kessler, CEO of Helios Systems, sat. He was the kind of man who didn't need to announce his power. He simply expected the room to bow to it. He didn't stand when she approached. He barely looked up, just a quick, icy glance before returning to his papers, as if to remind her who was really important here. No one spoke. The only sounds were the low hum of the AC and Amara's heels tapping against the floor. Each step echoed with the silent judgment pressing down on her. But she didn't lower her head. She didn't avert her eyes. Shoulders square, chin high, gaze steady. She'd been in rooms like this too many times before, rooms where power draped itself in the language of professionalism to disguise exclusion. And you watching this might ask yourself, who is she? Why walk into a room that clearly doesn't want her there? The answer: Amara Lewis didn't come here for their approval. She didn't come here for a seat at the table. She came to prove that this table exists only because she allows it. And this was just the beginning. She reached the head of the table, standing tall, and extended her hand. A simple gesture, a universal signal of respect. A handshake. An acknowledgement of basic equality at the negotiating table. Robert Kessler didn't take it. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like a fortress, his voice cutting through the air. "I don't shake hands with employees." For a moment, the room froze. Then came the chuckles. Not joyous laughter. The knowing, complicit snickers of men who thought they were watching a good joke. A few nodded approvingly. Others leaned back, waiting to see how she would squirm. If you were there, how would it feel to be the only one in a room full of power diminished, stripped of dignity with a single sentence? That feeling, it's like a fist to the gut. This wasn't just a rejection. This was a public humiliation. Amara stared directly at Robert. No flinch, no retreat, no visible crack for them to exploit. Inside, she recognized the sound, the same sound men like Robert had made for generations, the sneering laughter of power, crushing dignity as a sport. Robert wasn't done. He tilted his head, lips curling into a smirk as he twisted the knife. "Are you sure you're in the right room?" Laughter rippled again. The men didn't object. Nobody intervened. Some exchanged looks, enjoying the performance. To them, Amara wasn't a participant in this meeting. She was a misplaced extra on their stage. But Amara wasn't an extra. And if you've followed her story this far, you can feel that storm brewing in the silence. Robert and his allies hadn't realized it yet, but they had just set themselves up. They thought they were in control of this stage. They had no idea that the woman standing before them had come not for a handshake, but to decide who still deserved a seat at this table. No one in that room understood that this moment of humiliation was only the prelude. Amara lowered her hand, but her eyes never left Robert's. Inside, she was still as water. No explosive rage, no shame, no defense, just a steady, impenetrable calm that made the laughter in the room suddenly sound hollow. Then she spoke quietly, but sharp enough to slice through the air. "Good, I don't shake hands with subordinates." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten, but the words landed like a blade. The room fell silent. Robert froze. His smirk faltered, his face twitching as he sat up straight, no longer reclining in smug comfort. For the first time, he really looked at her. Amara didn't elaborate. She simply pulled out the chair, sat down, and opened her notebook as if nothing had happened. Was it defiance? Was it a counterattack? A declaration that the balance of power had never been his to begin with? No one could say for sure, but everyone felt the shift. The silence now belonged to Amara. She'd turned it into a weapon. Robert glanced around for support, but the men who had laughed with him were suddenly staring at their papers, avoiding his eyes. And in that moment, everyone in that room was thinking the same thing you're thinking now. Who is she? Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her very presence was the answer. Beneath the table, she uncapped her pen and wrote one short note in her leather journal. Not business prep. A reminder to herself. Time to flip the table. Robert Kessler didn't know it yet, but the humiliation he'd staged for her had just become the trap he'd walked into himself. Amara leaned back, scanning the room like a chessboard. And in that quiet moment, everyone understood. The woman they had dismissed wasn't a guest in their house. She was the one deciding who got to stay. Amara had arrived at Helios earlier than her scheduled meeting. She always did. Not out of nervousness, not out of haste, but because she wanted to watch, to listen, to see what people say when they think no one is paying attention. The main lobby of Helios Systems was built to impress. A cathedral of corporate excess soaring ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting every step, and a front desk positioned like a gatekeeper to legitimacy. But Amara didn't care about the spectacle. She cared about the people moving through it. As she approached the reception desk, she caught the eye of the security guard. He gave her a single glance, scanning her head to toe a look that didn't need words but said everything. You don't belong here. She offered a polite smile and stepped forward. Good morning. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Robert Kessler, Amara said, her voice calm. measured. The receptionist, a young blonde, glanced up from her screen. Her polite smile didn't hide the flicker of skepticism. "You're here for the assistant interview." "Right. The candidate lounge is over there." Amara paused for a beat. She didn't correct her immediately. She simply looked the woman in the eye, her expression unshaken. "No," Amara replied, her tone even. "I'm here to meet with Mr. Kessler." The receptionist frowned, double-checked her monitor, then silently gestured toward a set of stiff-backed chairs against the far wall away from the leather seating and glass coffee tables reserved for real guests. "You can wait there." Amara walked over without protest, without complaint, but inside, she was cataloging everything: how the staff treated those they considered unimportant, how the security guard's gaze slid over her with unmasked dismissal. From that hard, uninviting chair, Amara had a clear view of the entire lobby. It was like watching a stage, and she saw the script play out, exactly as Helios had written it. Two sharply dressed white men entered, talking loudly, laughing. The receptionist practically snapped to attention, her smile instant and radiant. "Good morning, gentlemen. Please have a seat in our VIP lounge. Coffee will be brought to you shortly." They were escorted to the plush leather chairs, surrounded by financial magazines and bottled water on a polished glass table, an unspoken ritual of deference. Just moments earlier, Amara had seen something very different. A young black technician, still in his oil-stained work jacket, stepped off the elevator carrying a stack of documents. He barely made it to the front desk before a middle-aged manager tossed him another pile of folders. "Take these to storage. Hurry up. Don't keep them waiting." "No thanks, no acknowledgement, just orders." The technician nodded and walked away without protest. His expression blank, the look of someone used to being treated like a pair of hands, not a person. Amara absorbed it all. This wasn't just about inefficiency or poor manners. This was culture and ecosystem where status dictated humanity. An older woman entered next, clutching a folder to her chest. The receptionist barely glanced at her before gesturing toward the same stiff chairs where Amara sat. No water, no pleasantries, just another shadow in a space designed for the chosen few. And Amara. She didn't flinch. She'd seen this pattern too many times, companies draped in the language of professionalism, yet operating by unspoken rules that decided who mattered and who didn't. She leaned back, hands resting lightly on her leather bag. She wasn't some passive visitor waiting her turn. She was an observer, documenting every invisible line of Helios's hierarchy. They thought she was on the margins, but this was the center of the board. Across the room, a young server in a black uniform brought a tray of steaming coffee to the men in the VIP lounge, bowing slightly before retreating. No tray for Amara. No tray for the older woman beside her. A small detail, but a loud one. Amara smiled faintly. They didn't realize it, but in their smallest actions, they'd revealed their true nature, and she would use every bit of it. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and opened a single contact, Jonas. Jonas Walker, the one man she trusted implicitly, her right hand in more battles than she could count. She typed one word, "ready." The message was sent. To anyone else, it would seem meaningless, but Jonas would understand. It was the signal, the key to unlocking a plan that had been set in motion weeks ago. Amara put the phone away, fingers brushing over the smooth leather of her bag like closing a diary. Her face remained unchanged, betraying nothing. But if you looked closely, her gaze had sharpened, focused like a blade. If you were watching her now, you'd ask ready for what is she planning? Amara let those questions hang in the air. She was used to being underestimated, shoved into the corner like an afterthought. They didn't know that from this seat, this overlooked corner, she could see the entire game. The receptionist's voice finally broke through the hum of the lobby. "Mrs. Lewis, Mr. Kessler will see you now." Amara rose, straightened her collar, and walked toward the elevator with deliberate calm. She took one last glance at the lobby, a final sweep of the stage where Helios had unknowingly revealed its lines. This wasn't just a meeting. This was an audit of their culture, and they had already failed the test. With one word sent, Amara had triggered the next move. The game had officially begun. The top-floor boardroom at Helios gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, sterile and cold like an operating theater. The leather chairs were arranged with surgical precision around a long table, and at its head sat Robert Kessler, no crown, no throne, but no one in the room would dare question who held the power here. When Amara stepped in, none of the directors so much as lifted their heads in acknowledgement. They gave her quick, dismissive glances, then returned to their files as though her presence wasn't worth their attention. Robert didn't speak right away. He let her sit first, letting the silence stretch, wielding it like a blade to remind everyone who controlled the room. Then, as though struck by an amusing thought, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and said loud enough for the entire room to hear, "I'm guessing you like your coffee sweet, with plenty of cream, just like the folks in our cafeteria." The moment froze. Chairs creaked as people shifted. A few muffled chuckles broke the silence. Not everyone laughed, but enough of them did to fill the space Robert carved out for his little performance. This wasn't small talk. Everyone in that room knew exactly what he meant. He was aiming at her skin, at the place they thought she belonged in the hierarchy of this building. To an outsider, it might sound like an offhand joke, but to Amara, to anyone who had lived through moments like these, it wasn't humor. It was a message: you are beneath us, and we want you to know it. No one objected. No one spoke up. The silence became complicity. Quick side glances flicked toward her, watching, waiting for a reaction. Then more laughter, sharper this time, filling the room until it was hard to breathe. Amara sat still, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her face gave nothing away, but inside, she felt the wave rising, not the wild, untempered anger they expected, but something deeper, colder. The kind of anger built over years of enduring comments like this from men who thought their power gave them the right to humiliate. Robert tilted his head, that smug grin still painted across his face, as if savoring the moment. Anyone watching this scene could feel their own pulse quicken, not just for Amara, but because they'd been there too, in rooms where their dignity was chipped away with a single joke carrying the weight of an entire history. The boardroom wasn't a meeting space anymore. It was an arena. Every gaze locked on Amara, waiting for her to answer. An answer that could silence the room. But she didn't respond. Not yet. She let the seconds stretch, long enough for the laughter to sour in their throats, long enough for Robert's smirk to stiffen. Then, she tilted her head just slightly, but enough to make everyone hold their breath. She smiled. Not the smile of someone eager to please, not the tight, pained grin of someone swallowing humiliation. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what game was being played and was ready to flip the board. "No sugar," she said evenly, her voice soft but carrying to every corner. "I like my coffee black strong and uncompromising." No one spoke. The hum of the air conditioner became deafening. Those who laughed a moment ago ducked their heads, suddenly fascinated by their papers. Robert froze, the smirk on his face curdling before it disappeared completely. He straightened, gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring himself. Her answer wasn't just a retort, it was a declaration. She had turned his insult into a stage and claimed it. In that moment, Amara made it clear she wasn't here to be diminished. Her identity wasn't a punchline. It was power, and it would not be diluted. The rest of the room shifted. Eyes turned toward her, reassessing. They no longer saw her as a guest, or worse, an interloper. Amara had stepped out of the box Robert tried to put her in and crushed it under her heel. If you were there, you could feel it, the razor-thin line between submissive silence and commanding silence. Amara didn't need to shout. She didn't need to seethe. She owned the moment with poise, and that poise cut sharper than any outburst could. Her words sliced through the heavy air, and no one dared follow them. Then, deliberately, she closed her portfolio. The soft thud of the leather cover seemed louder than it should have been, punctuating her statement. She scanned the room, unhurried, meeting every face. Some directors lowered their gaze, pretending to read their notes. Others looked back, uncertain, trying to place this woman who wouldn't play her role. Robert said nothing. Sweat beaded faintly at his hairline. He'd thought he'd won the moment. Now. He sat exposed, his petty power move dismantled with one sentence. Amara, on the other hand, wasn't looking at them as superiors. She was studying them, cataloging every flinch, every twitch, every glimpse of their true selves. She opened a small leather notebook and jotted down a line. No one knew what she wrote, but it wasn't the notes of someone desperate to impress. It was the evaluation of someone deciding whether Helios was even worthy of what she'd come to offer. A director cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. Robert pounced on the sound, speaking quickly, as if to regain control. "Well then, Mrs. Lewis, shall we discuss our potential partnership?" But the tone was different now. No longer a condescending king on his throne, but a man testing the waters, unsure of his footing. Amara didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, to the gray sprawl of the city below. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was an exam, and with every smirk, every laugh, every exposed weakness, Helios had already written its answers. Amara turned back to the room, her expression calm, almost serene. And in that moment, she wasn't a guest. She was the one holding the red pen. No one in that room knew the real game had already begun. Amara sat still, one hand resting lightly on the cover of her portfolio, calm enough to seem like any polite guest at a corporate meeting. But inside, the gears were spinning at a speed no one could fathom. She had seen enough to know Helios didn't just have a few bad players, the rot ran through its core, and enough to decide it was time to rip the curtain down. She leaned slightly, opened her bag, and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up, reflecting eyes that were calm but razor-sharp like the surface of a storm. She scrolled to a name only she fully understood the weight of: Jonas Walker. Jonas, her right hand, her silent partner, the one who had built plans with her that could shake entire markets with a single keystroke. Amara typed one word: execute. She stared at it for a moment before pressing send, like sealing a verdict. Her finger glided across the screen. The message disappeared, but its weight reverberated through the room, a weight only she, and anyone watching this unfold, could truly feel. Have you ever witnessed a moment that looked quiet, ordinary, but beneath it, you knew an earthquake was beginning? That was this moment. She set the phone down, adjusted her posture, and sat just as she had before. No one noticed. Robert kept droning on about Helios's accomplishments, the directors nodding along as if every word he spoke were gospel. None of them realized that. In a small corner of the table, the woman they'd dismissed had just pulled a lever that would shake their entire world. If you were watching, you'd feel your heart race. You'd be asking, execute what did she just set in motion that they don't even know about? The moment wasn't loud. No slamming fists, no threats, just one word, one message: But that's the kind of signal only people fluent in quiet power understand when you don't need to shout, because the smallest move can create chaos. Amara glanced at the clock, beyond the windows. The city moved on, oblivious to the wave that was beginning to build deep in the market. She turned back to Robert, listening to every word he said. While he basked in his illusion of control, Amara knew in a matter of hours, everything he thought he held in his grasp would slip away without warning, without mercy. And it all started with one word: execute. Just a few blocks away, on the 25th floor of Lewis Capital, a chain reaction ignited. Amara's message landed on Jonas Walker's phone, and for him, no further explanation was necessary. Jonas sat before a massive screen, numbers flashing in a constant rhythm of global trades. With a single tap, he sent the signal to his analysts and traders, all prepped for this moment for weeks. Phase 1, Jonas said, his voice flat but sharp. No one asked for clarification. They'd drilled this scenario endlessly, every contingency mapped, every move rehearsed. On the screens, the first sell orders hit, not small, cautious trades but blocks big enough to draw eyes. Across the market, savvy investors spotted the sudden movements in Helios stock. Whispers spread like wildfire. Something's wrong with Helios. Jonas leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the data. He knew how fear moves the market. A spark can burn down a forest. And Amara had just handed him that spark. The trading floor hummed with controlled chaos. Calls went out to brokers. Quick reports fired to influential analysts. The moves weren't random. They were a message: Helios is in trouble, and the smart money is leaving. Can you picture it? One text. Minutes later, a multi-billion-dollar company begins sliding off a cliff it didn't even know it was standing on. Jonas checked the time. It wasn't even mid-morning yet. He pictured Amara in Helios's boardroom, listening to Robert brag about their vision, while outside, the financial world was quietly tilting in her favor. Prepare for Phase 2, Jonas said. His team moved instantly, drafting leaks for top financial media outlets. No one at Lewis Capital needed to shout. They knew the market's rule whisper in the right places, and the herd will do the rest. Jonas allowed himself a small smile. The storm was forming, and Helios still thought the sky was clear. But soon, every seat of power there would shake. Back in the top-floor boardroom, the air was heavy not with fear, but with the false confidence of men convinced they controlled the room. Robert Kessler was still talking, preaching about Helios's bold strategies and unmatched growth trajectory, his voice inflated with self-importance. The directors nodded, some scribbling in notebooks just to look engaged. At the far end of the table, Amara sat quietly, her hand resting on the closed portfolio. No notes, no interruptions. She didn't need to. The important moves were already in play, and she knew that while Robert flaunted his so-called power, the ground beneath him was already eroding. In less than 30 minutes since her message, Helios's stock had dropped 8%. Enough to set off alarm bells for anyone who understood the game, but in this room, no one noticed. They were still wrapped in their illusion of control. Amara checked the clock again. Every second stretched, but she didn't rush. She knew this feeling well, the stillness before the storm. It wasn't anxiety, it was certainty. Picture it: a boardroom full of men boasting about their empire, while outside, piece by piece, it's already coming apart. Robert kept going, listing promising projects and stable growth metrics, his voice louder now, as if trying to drown out an unease he couldn't name. He didn't see Amara's gaze cold, calculating, like someone who had already read the final chapter of his story. Outside, investors whispered, analysts scrambled, brokers sent quiet warnings to their biggest clients. Helios was no longer a rock. It was a landslide waiting to happen. Amara adjusted in her chair, leaning back slightly. The storm hadn't hit yet, but she could feel it forming. And when it broke, the men in this room would be the last to know they were never in control. For now, she let them talk. Let them believe the sky was still clear. But you watching this, you know the truth. The storm is already here, and Helios will be the first to feel it. Outside the boardroom, while Robert was still rambling about Helios's bright future, an entirely different story was erupting. On social media, a 2-minute audio clip surfaced across major platforms with a single, cutting caption. Hear what Helios leadership really thinks about their employees and partners. It was a recording from this very morning's meeting. Robert's voice was crystal clear, undeniable. I don't shake hands with employees. Followed by the so-called clever quip he thought was funny, I bet you like your coffee sweet with lots of cream. Like the servers in our cafeteria. Can you imagine the reaction? Anyone who's ever tasted the sting of subtle workplace humiliation, anyone who's endured jokes that cut like knives, recognized that language instantly. And they were furious. The hashtag exposed Helios appeared first on a few personal accounts. Then it spread like wildfire. Tweets replaying the clip flooded in, accompanied by outraged commentary. This is how a CEO talks about his partners. This is who Helios really is. Within an hour, the recording had been shared tens of thousands of times. Workplace equity forums lit up with discussions. Financial news outlets caught wind and pushed it to their breaking news segments. Helios Systems faces discrimination allegations following leaked audio. Fury. That was the first wave. People weren't just angry about Robert's words. They were enraged by what those words represented, an entrenched, toxic culture they themselves had experienced. Then came shock. Shock that the conversations once hidden behind the glossy walls of corporate giants were now laid bare. Shock that the whispered suspicions about what these leaders really said had finally been confirmed with undeniable proof. And then, a spark of hope. Comments shifted. Maybe this will finally force Helios to change. It's time someone stood up and ended this culture. Amara watched the news spread on her phone. No triumphant smirk, no outward satisfaction. Just a small, knowing nod. This wasn't personal revenge. It was exposure. A way for the world to see what Helios had buried under layers of polished PR. And she knew from this moment on, Robert Kessler no longer controlled the narrative. The narrative belonged to the public. As the recording continued to circulate, something no one expected happened. Silenced voices began to emerge. Former Helios employees, people who had worked under Robert, started sharing their stories. First, an anonymous post on a popular professional forum. I used to work at Helios. What you heard in that clip, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Then another. This time signed by name Robert, once told me directly that no matter how good I was, I'd never sit at the decision-making table because this company needs a consistent image. The stories cut like blades, slicing through Helios' carefully constructed facade. Within hours, dozens of accounts appeared across multiple platforms. Employees who had once stayed silent out of fear of losing their jobs now spoke with unexpected courage. They recounted meetings where their opinions were dismissed, promotions they were denied for not fitting the culture. Words like humiliated, deliberately excluded appeared again and again, adding fuel to the raging fire. The media swarmed. Journalists reached out to these voices, verified their stories, and published the first in-depth investigations inside Helios, the exclusionary culture behind the tech shine. Some outlets even aired brief interviews with former employees, voices still trembling, but eyes steady. We can't stay silent anymore. The market reacted almost instantly, and this wasn't just social media chatter anymore, it was front-page financial news. Big investors called each other in hushed urgency. How much of this is true? Can the company survive a reputation crisis this size? Then came the inevitable Helios stock plunged further. The morning's 8% drop swelled to 15%. Major brokerage firms issued risk warnings. Some institutional funds quietly pulled out, unwilling to bet on a sinking ship. What had once been Robert's pride now blazed red on trading screens, hard evidence that trust in Helios was crumbling. In the boardroom, Robert was still oblivious, still droning on about Helios's core values. But outside, his image had been rewritten, no longer the powerful CEO, but the symbol of a toxic culture dragged into the light. Amara followed the updates on her phone. Everything was unfolding exactly as she planned. But what made her smile wasn't the plummeting stock price. It was this: silenced voices had finally been heard, and this time, no one could shut them down. While Helios spiraled in chaos it didn't yet recognize, Amara slipped out of the boardroom as quietly as if she were only going for a coffee. None of the men at that table realized how big the storm outside had grown. She found a quiet corner near a wide glass window, opened her laptop, and dove into her inbox. The emails poured in like floodwater. Almost all carried the same subject line: urgent Helios situation. And these weren't from small players. They were from institutional investors, the kinds of funds whose names alone made Wall Street CEOs sit up straight. Amara opened them one by one. Familiar messages, requests for urgent briefings, inquiries about Lewis Capital's stance on Helios, even proposals for joint assessments to reevaluate the company's entire valuation. One message made her raise an eyebrow. "If you're exiting your position, we want advance consultation. Please inform us immediately." That was it. The clearest sign yet that trust in Helios had shattered at the very top. She didn't need to do anything more. Momentum was pulling the system exactly where she'd mapped it weeks ago. She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city cars threading the streets, towers glowing under the afternoon sun. But she knew that across the financial district, emergency meetings were underway. Fund managers were debating whether to hold or dump Helios stock before its value bled out even further. If you followed this story from the beginning, this is the moment where the tension eases, not because the storm has passed, but because you realize Amara now has complete control. These emails weren't just correspondence, they were an unspoken admission she had the upper hand. Amara opened a new document and typed a brief note to Jonas Phase 1 complete, awaiting signal for next phase. No long explanations. Jonas would understand. She closed the laptop and allowed herself a small smile. Not the gloating smile of revenge, the calm smile of someone who had just placed another critical piece in a much larger plan, forcing Helios to pay for the culture it fostered and showing men like Robert Kessler that their era was over. Far away, in the boardroom, Robert still clung to his monologue. He had no idea the game ended long before he opened his mouth. And Amara, with her lethal calm, was the one who rewrote all the rules. The next morning, the main offices of Lewis Capital looked as serene as always. Morning light poured through the massive glass windows, glinting off the polished stone floors and highlighting the deliberate elegance of every design detail. But everyone in that building knew better. The quiet was only surface deep. Behind the closed doors of its meeting rooms, decisions that could shake entire markets were being made. And today, someone had been forced to walk into that space: Robert Kessler. He arrived unannounced. No glossy limousine like before, just a dark car hastily parked out front. When he stepped out, the man who once radiated arrogance now looked like a shadow of himself. His suit was still flawless, but his face told a different story: dark circles under his eyes, lips pressed tight, and that small, restless tug on his tie as if trying to reclaim the authority slipping away from his grasp. The receptionists in the lobby recognized him instantly. Whispers flitted between them. Everyone knew this was the CEO of Helios, a man now standing in the center of a media firestorm. But no one said anything. They simply alerted the executive floor that Robert Kessler was here. As he was led to the conference room, Robert walked slowly down the long hallway, his gaze wandering over the framed artwork depictions of individuals breaking boundaries, challenging limits. Perhaps, in that moment, he understood here. Power didn't lie in titles or corner offices. It belonged to those who could change the game. Amara was waiting. She sat at the head of the table, calm, composed as if this meeting had been scheduled all along. No coffee, no thick binders of documents, just her and a small notebook in front of her. Robert paused at the doorway. For a fleeting second, the man who once refused her handshake now looked smaller than he ever had. He approached the table, took a deep breath, and finally spoke. "Amara, I came here to apologize." His voice was hoarse, faintly trembling, a stark contrast to the dismissive tone of yesterday. "I admit I was wrong. My behavior caused serious harm, not just to you, but to Helios. I'm hoping we can work together to repair this." Silence. Amara didn't respond right away. She looked at him as if analyzing a volatile market trend patient, calculating, gathering data before making a call. If you were there, you could feel the tension straining the air. Here was a man who once sat above everyone else, now bowing his head. But Amara wasn't someone who could be swayed by late apologies. She closed her notebook, set her pen down, and locked eyes with him. And in that moment, Robert knew what came next would not be pleasant. Amara wasn't here to soothe egos. She was here to rewrite the rules. She didn't acknowledge his apology. Instead, she leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table, her gaze no longer detached but razor-sharp, the look of someone about to pass judgment. "You say you want to repair this," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. "But what you really want is to save yourself and your company. So, I'll be direct, there's no going back to how things were. Either Helios changes at its core, or it collapses." Robert shifted uncomfortably. He was used to negotiations where he dictated the terms. This time, the control wasn't his. Amara opened her notebook to a pre-written page. 3 conditions. Non-negotiable. Her voice didn't rise, but it sliced through the room, stripping away the last remnants of Robert's composure. First, transparency. Helios must make public its entire pay structure and HR policies. No more gray areas. Every employee must know exactly where they stand, fair, clear, and verifiable. Robert started to object, but Amara raised her hand to silence him. "Don't wait until I finish." Second, diversity. Helios will overhaul its hiring and promotion strategy to guarantee equitable opportunities regardless of race, gender, or background. I'm not talking about shiny slogans for social media. I want hard numbers, quarterly progress reports, and measurable change. Robert's hands clenched together, sweat starting to gather at his temples. Third, independent oversight. A fully external council, with no ties to Helios, will monitor and enforce these changes. I will choose its members, and their findings will be made public. She closed her notebook, her eyes locking onto his. This isn't a proposal. These are the terms. Accept them, or lose everything. If you were there, you'd see Robert's face shift confusion, then panic, then the dawning realization that he'd been cornered. This wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict, and Amar was holding the gavel. The room went still. Robert swallowed hard, his gaze darting between the door and the woman in front of him. He knew these weren't reforms. They were scalpels cutting straight into the bones of the empire he'd built. Finally, he found his voice. Amara, I understand your concerns, but we're talking about a corporation with tens of thousands of employees. What you're asking needs time. I can commit to reform, but only if we negotiate the details. Amara didn't blink. She studied him, searching for sincerity, but finding only evasion. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her tone now so cold it seemed to freeze the air. No, Robert, this isn't a negotiation. This is a sentence. He opened his mouth to push back, but she cut him off. Do you think you still have time to bargain? No, you don't understand. Time is what you no longer have. Every hour, Helios stock drops further. Investors are already calling me, asking about my next move. The question isn't if they'll pull out, it's when. Robert sank back in his chair, dizzy. The man who once ruled his boardroom with absolute authority now sat stripped of it, realizing how fragile it had always been. Amara folded her hands, her voice like the final cut of a blade. Accept my 3 conditions. Or, she let the silence stretch, each tick of the wall clock amplifying the weight of her words. I'll let the market finish what I started. Robert blinked. He understood instantly. This wasn't just about Lewis Capital divesting. This was about her ability to trigger a mass exodus to hollow Helios out until nothing remained but a corporate shell. If you were in that room, you'd see Robert deflate, as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. No more clever arguments, no more bravado, just a man cornered, staring at the executioner. Amara leaned back, eyes never leaving him. The choice is yours. But remember this, Robert, I don't bluff. In that silent, suffocating room, power had shifted hands. And Robert Kessler, the man who once believed he was untouchable, now sat like someone awaiting his sentence. Helios had seen dark days before, but never had the boardroom felt this suffocating. The sun had barely risen, yet the board members were already assembled. They all knew this meeting wasn't just about a title, it was about the very survival of the company. Robert Kessler sat at one end of the table, staring blankly at the papers before him. His suit was still pressed to perfection, but his face looked as though it had aged a decade in the 2 days since the crisis erupted. The leaked recording, the public outrage, the free-falling stock price, everything he had tried to keep buried was now stripped bare for the world to see. And now, the very allies he once counted as his people were preparing to cut the last lifeline. The board chairman, a silver-haired man with a calm yet razor-edged voice, opened the meeting. Helios no longer has the luxury of hesitation. Investor confidence is crumbling by the hour. We need decisive action. Nods of agreement followed. A few averted their eyes, unwilling to be the first to say it, but knowing there was no other choice. Then, a female board member spoke up. Let's vote on removing Robert Kessler from his position as CEO. The words fell like a gavel striking wood. Robert looked up, eyes wide, but said nothing. What defense could he give? The evidence was everywhere. The company's value was in freefall. One by one, hands rose, not a single dissenting vote. When the chairman announced the result, Robert leaned back in his chair, his eyes vacant. A reign had ended quietly. Completely. But Helios couldn't stop there. We need someone new to lead, the chairman continued. Someone who can rebuild our culture, restore trust, and pull this company out of the mire. The name was spoken Elena Harper. Elena stepped into the room, a composed woman in her mid-50s with neatly tied brown hair and a gaze that seemed to cut through pretense. She wasn't a stranger. For years. As Helios's CFO, Elena had proven her integrity and resilience in the company's toughest moments. She didn't start with lofty promises. Helios doesn't just need a new CEO, Elena said firmly. Helios needs a new soul. If you trust me, I'll lead this company with transparency, fairness, and real accountability. The atmosphere shifted. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope lit the room. The board voted again. Within minutes, Elena Harper was officially the new CEO of Helios. If you've been following this story, this is where your chest feels a little lighter. Helios might have been in freefall, but now, there was a hand strong enough to pull it back up. A new chapter had begun, not for Robert, but for all those who had been forgotten under his reign. Within a day of her appointment, Elena Harper did something Robert Kessler had never even considered. She left the top floor and walked among the people who kept Helios running. No scripted meet and greets, no entourage of assistants, just real conversations, raw, unfiltered, without anyone standing by to manage the narrative. She started in the engineering department, where wires tangled across workbenches and the hum of machinery filled the air. Elena stood among them and said simply, "I'm here to listen. I want to know what Helios really is in your eyes." At first, silence. These were employees long accustomed to having their voices ignored. But then, a young engineer with oil-stained hands spoke, "We feel invisible. We bring up ideas, but nobody listens." After a while, we stopped talking, because what's the point? His voice was steady, but his eyes carried a quiet pain. Elena didn't argue. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She nodded, writing every word down. In customer service, an older woman described being berated by her manager in front of the team for not fitting the brand image. Her voice trembled as she said, "I've been here over 10 years. But sometimes I wonder if Helios ever really saw me as one of their own." In the design wing, a black employee shared how he'd been excluded from a major project with no explanation. "They said I wasn't ready," he muttered, "but I think they just wanted a different face to present to the client." The stories poured out, not rants, not petty complaints, but deep, festering wounds finally given air. Tears welled, bitter laughs slipped out, avoided gazes spoke volumes. Together, they formed a portrait of Helios, a company that gleamed on the outside but was rotting within. Elena listened to it all, not just with her ears, but with her heart. She sat with them, asked for details, and dug into the roots of their pain. And with every story, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. Helios didn't just need financial recovery, it needed healing. If you're following this, maybe you feel that lump in your throat too. This wasn't about a tech company and its numbers. This was about people. People long overlooked, now finally seen. And maybe, just maybe, you start to believe Helios really could change. Within a week of these conversations, Elena Harper moved to action. No flashy press conferences, no performative speeches for investors. She started at the root. Policy 1. Pay transparency. Every salary from executives to new hires was published internally. No more shadows for those in power to manipulate. Longtime employees who had quietly suspected they were underpaid finally had the truth in front of them. One veteran engineer told Elena for the first time, "I don't feel like I'm fighting blind." Policy 2. Cultural audit. An independent team was brought in to assess the work environment. They didn't report to Helios leadership. They published their findings directly to employees and investors. The numbers were brutal. Nearly half of employees felt their voices weren't respected, and many had witnessed discrimination but stayed silent out of fear. Elena didn't hide the report. She stood before the entire company and said, "This is the truth, and this is where we begin." Policy 3. Diversity in leadership. Helios set concrete targets for women and minorities in executive roles, along with development programs to prepare qualified employees for those positions. Elena knew it wouldn't change overnight, but every step would push Helios closer to the company it needed to be. The changes were met with skepticism at first. Some investors fretted, "Won't this slow growth?" But then came the signals. Employees who had been planning to leave stayed. Top talent from across the industry applied to join Helios. On the market, the chaos began to calm. The stock stopped free-falling. Weeks later, it stabilized, then began to climb. A prominent analyst wrote Helios is transforming from a symbol of toxic corporate culture into proof that real reform can save an empire. If you've been following this story, you feel that now change isn't just possible, it's happening. Not in press releases or investor calls, in the people, in the culture, in the very soul of Helios. Elena Harper knows the road ahead will be long, but she also knows this Helios has planted the seeds of a new culture, and they are beginning to grow. On a clear morning, the grand hall of the New York Convention Center was packed. Rows of velvet-covered chairs stretched perfectly in line, and warm lights cast a glow across the faces of hundreds of investors, entrepreneurs, and top corporate leaders. This wasn't just another annual financial conference. Everyone knew today, Amara Lewis would take the stage. Since the Helios crisis, Amara's name had become impossible to ignore in global investment circles. But the crowd wasn't here just to see the woman who had brought a tech empire to its knees. They came for something bigger, something that might redefine the way their entire industry worked. The hum of the room dimmed as Amara stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple suit, no flashy jewelry, yet every step radiated the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was about to say something that could change the game. She stood at the podium, pausing for a moment to take in the crowd. No flashy slides, no dramatic intro video, just her and the microphone. "We don't just invest in numbers." Her voice rang out, steady and deliberate. "We invest in people." The room fell utterly silent. It wasn't the kind of opening line they expected at a financial summit, but it pulled them all in. "For years," Amara continued, "we've allowed balance sheets and profit reports to define success. But Helios taught us a bitter truth if we ignore the human factor. Those beautiful numbers are nothing but a hollow shell. You can build an empire in the market, but if its culture is rotting inside, it will collapse overnight." She scanned the audience, locking eyes with several of them. "That's why. Starting today, Lewis Capital is adopting a new standard for investment. We will no longer fund companies based solely on their profit potential. We will assess how they treat their employees, how they create opportunities for all, and the transparency of their operations." You could feel the room shift. This wasn't just a speech, it was a challenge to the entire industry. "Investing isn't only about maximizing returns," Amara said, her voice growing stronger. "It's about creating sustainable value built on fairness, transparency, and respect. And if a company can't meet those standards, no matter how lucrative the numbers look, they will not get our partnership." In the audience, heads nodded. Some scribbled notes, already understanding that this would shape their strategies moving forward. If you've been following this story, you can feel it too. Pride swelling. This wasn't about payback anymore. This was a moment where one woman turned experience into a new standard for the entire investment world. And from this moment, the rules had changed. Amara's message didn't end on that stage. The next day, Lewis Capital formally released its new investment standards across all media channels. The document spanned dozens of pages, but its core was simple transparency in operations, diversity in leadership, and responsibility to the community. From now on, Any company seeking capital from Lewis Capital would have to meet these standards, no exceptions. The financial world trembled. For decades, funds had cared only about profits and growth, leaving corporate culture and social equity as side notes. But now, one of the most powerful firms was rewriting the rules, led by a woman who had once been dismissed in the very boardrooms she was now reshaping. The reactions came fast. Some CEOs scoffed. This could slow progress. One anonymous executive told a financial outlet, but others immediately saw opportunity. They knew Lewis Capital didn't just bring funding, it brought market trust, and trust could raise a company's value more than any earnings report. Within a month, at least 10 major companies announced plans to reform in line with Lewis Capital's standards. A global tech conglomerate promised to publish its salary reports. A multinational retail chain launched an initiative to increase women and minorities in leadership. Even conservative firms were holding emergency meetings to discuss adjusting their HR and operational policies. The media called it the Amara effect. Articles hailed Lewis Capital's decision as a turning point in investment history. Profit and ethics no longer have to be separate roads. Read one editorial in The Global Investor. Amara Lewis has shown they can walk hand in hand and even strengthen each other. But the most striking responses didn't come from headlines or analysts. They came from everyday people. Employees began posting online. Finally, someone is forcing our leadership to listen. A female engineer wrote, "I never thought I'd see the day when a fund demanded my company create a transparent promotion path. Today, I believe it can happen." If you've been following this story, this is when you realize what began in one suffocating boardroom had spread across an entire industry. Amara didn't just change Helios, she was forcing the entire business world to face itself. And once a new standard is set, there's no going back without consequences. That evening, New York was bathed in the golden glow of sunset. From the top floor of Lewis Capital, Amara stood silently by the massive window, eyes fixed on the distant Helios headquarters, its glass facade catching the dying light, a reminder of everything that had been and everything yet to come. Weeks had passed since the day she walked into that Helios boardroom as an underestimated outsider. Now, everything had changed. The company's stock was stabilizing. Helena Harper's reforms were showing tangible results, and Helios employees were sending Amara thank you emails. "You forced this company to change." Some wrote that for the first time. They felt their voices mattered. Amara read them all. They weren't flattery. They were real stories: an engineer once excluded from projects now leading a new team. A woman finally being paid fairly after years of quiet inequity. A janitor describing how management now held listening sessions for staff like him. Small changes, but undeniable proof that Helios was moving in the right direction. But for Amara, this wasn't the end. She turned from the window, her eyes alight with determination. What happened at Helios had proven one thing: power wasn't in the numbers alone, it was in making those numbers serve people. And this was only the beginning of that vision. She remembered the faces at the conference as she unveiled the new standards, the skepticism, the curiosity, the eventual nods of agreement. She knew changing an industry wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. Critics claiming that transparency and equity burdened business. But Amara also knew this once a new standard was set. There was no going back without being seen for what you really were. She returned to her desk, picked up the phone, and left a message for Jonas. "We'll need a new plan." Helios was just the start. She stood there, alone in the wide office, watching as the city slipped into the lights of night. And in her head, her own voice steady, unshakable. "This is only the beginning." And you can feel it too. This story isn't closing. It's opening a new era, one where people like Amara dare to redefine power, using it not just to build wealth, but to rewrite the game entirely. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.